Well, hello everybody. My name is Bertha Vasquez. I am the director of the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, and I'm so glad you could join us again for take two of teaching biology with social justice in mind. For those of you that were with us last Thursday, it appears the entire Crowdcast platform went down. It wasn't just us. And I think, uh, can you just give me a thumbs up that, yay, you can hear me this time and you're seeing our faces and everything? Yes, hi. To make sure, because last time, we just started and Dr. Jones was doing a great job, and I started looking at the chat and I realized that you guys were not with us. So it was not a good feeling. Anyway, this is a very special session of the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science webinar series. Dr. Jones is a good friend of mine, and I'm very excited to have her here today. She's an associate professor of biology and science education at Valdosta State University in Georgia. Her biological research was in equine reproductive physiology before she became interested in the ways that social issues impact science education. She has worked extensively on addressing the evolution creationism controversy, as well as the development of anti-racist approaches to biological science. She includes anti-racist lessons in every biology course she teaches. And as a teacher educator, she wants the students in her education content classes to understand and be prepared to handle the racism they will see in schools. So I'm very happy to introduce you all today to my good friend, Dr. Jones. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for tuning in again if you were here last week or coming this time if you weren't. As Bertha said, I live in the southern part of the state of Georgia. I'm teaching at Valdosta State, and I'm just going to get right on with this webinar. When I was a graduate student, we were always trained to stay away from social value issues. Scientific knowledge was supposed to be objective and value-free, and scientific methodologies were supposed to keep us on track, and we just didn't get into social issues. And it was a very strict part of our training. So why would I be talking about addressing social justice in biology classes? Well, I want to give you two reasons in this talk tonight. The first is I really think biology has a historical responsibility for the reasons I'm going to go through, because racism itself was unfortunately started and propagated by biological and medical scientists in the colonial period. And the second thing I want to talk about is what we can do to distinguish nature from nurture. And as the abstract said about this talk, a lot of things it's very difficult to separate nature from nurture. But as far as these discussions of race and racism go, it's very easy, and that's what I'd like to do tonight. So I want to start by saying whenever I'm teaching my students, I put the word race in air quotes, because race is not a biological term. It's a socio-cultural proposition, as this slide says, but people seem to believe that there's a strong biological justification for race and separating people or racializing people on the basis of their ancestry. So to give you a little bit about my background and how I ended up getting involved in this, I do tread between two academic worlds. That's why I like the metaphor of a chameleon, because as a natural scientist, I was doing equine work. Now I'm writing an interactive learning online course that's transdisciplinary, goes through all of the sciences. But I'm also involved in the social sciences because I'm a science teacher educator. I was looking at evolution and creationism, but the wonderful thing is that a lot of things are showing that teaching evolution is not the problem it used to be. And now my work is basically centering on developing anti-racist biology curriculum. I want to tell you a little bit about how I grew up, because worldviews are very individual, and most people would like to know who's speaking to them when they listen to a talk. My worldview was certainly shaped by my personal experience, because my father was a naval officer, and my family traveled a lot. I went to 13 schools before I graduated from high school. But in 1962, when my family drove across country on our way to California, we stopped in Mississippi at a gas station, and I saw 3 bathrooms and 2 water fountains. And being a precocious little second grader, I wanted to know exactly why there were 3 bathrooms and 2 water fountains. The math didn't match with me. And so I was probably quite vociferously asking my mother these questions, and she was quite terrified that the Klan was going to peek out and throw our whole family into something. And it was something that I was just amazed with, and I kept asking about it. So when we got in the car, my father patiently explained, what goes on and why the South is so different and why we didn't ever have 3 bathrooms or 2 water fountains up in Connecticut where we'd been living before that. And it just stuck with me. I've never forgotten seeing that, even though I was so young when it happened. Well, instead of moving to California, my father's submarine got transferred to Hawaii, which was a wonderful thing for all of us. And we spent about 5 years going in and out of Hawaii because my father's submarines would get transferred there and transferred away. This is a view from our house most of the time I lived there. But we lived on the other side of the island of Oahu. So Pearl Harbor is over here. And we lived over this mountain range in Kailua. And I actually lived in the village of Lanikai. And when we lived on that side of the island because people told my parents it would be better for us to go to local schools than to be in school with all the military kids. And when Vietnam kicked in, my father was off on deployments all the time. So I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in Hawaii. In Hawaiian schools, people are very conscious of their ancestry. And a lot of people used to run around describing Hawaii as a big melting pot. Well, Hawaii's not really a big melting pot. Everybody knows their own ancestry. Yes, people back then were intermarrying, and a lot of my friends had mixed ancestry, but it's not that we all melted into one identity. And while we weren't, particularly racially conscious, we certainly didn't run around talking about things like colorblindness because everyone knew their ancestry. And I ran home and demanded to know what I was because I had no idea where my ancestors had come from, and my parents filled me in. But part of our schooling was always to take Hawaiian culture, and we learned a lot about Hawaiian religions in our classes at the local schools. And the one thing that's really key about that experience is that whiteness was not invisible when I lived in Hawaii. I knew that I was white, and it's a very important thing in research now that they talk about, you should situate your knowledge where you are. Well, I knew I was white because in Hawaii, I was a haole, and haole is pretty low on the status ladders in the local culture in Hawaii. That's a second to the bottom thing. So I knew I was a haole girl, and I learned very early on that I didn't learn that whites were really privileged and dominant. We were pretty low status over there. So it taught me to be aware of people, and it's probably the reason that I got into teaching for social justice. And when we asked who should teach for social justice, well, we were all learning a big lesson this summer, and I think everyone should be teaching for social justice, but that's not for me to say. I think one of the things about the natural sciences, we have so much social capital in the status that the sciences hold. And if we start to challenge discrimination, if we use the scientific energy and status that we do have, I think we can make a lot of inroads. Plus, as biologists, we can deconstruct the whole idea that race is biologically distinct. And I think this is a very important thing that we can do if we choose to. This is a quote by Cornel West. Who's a very, very famous speaker. And I like to say when I talk about these issues, and especially race and racism, I always tell my students or whatever audience I'm speaking to, I sort of feel like my white foot hangs precariously close to my white mouth, and it's trying to jump in if I'm not careful about what I say. But I've gotten very used to speaking about this, and some people will say, aren't you worried there'll be a blow up in your class? And I don't worry about those things, and I especially don't have to worry tonight because you're all muted and you can't talk back to me. I'm kidding when I say that. But I've really gotten very used to talking about this, and I hope it comes across tonight. The first part I want to go into is the historical responsibility I think we hold, especially in the biological sciences. There's something they never taught us about in school, and that is the fact that there was a thing called scientific racism. And when I first heard those two words together, I think I was probably aghast. But there were a lot of people that in Europe in the period when colonialism was really active, that went around creating contrived and distorted views of human variation. This picture is a very famous one. You can see what they're doing, comparing facial structure with intelligence. And what the point I'm trying to make is that history was not the only subject that was whitewashed. We talk about whitewashing of history. I went to 7th grade in Virginia, and they told us that slavery was a benevolent enterprise. And this was in the 1960s. And that's what nowadays we call the whitewashing of subjects. But science never talked about its racist history, and I think it's something that most people don't know about. During the period of the Enlightenment, when science was becoming stronger and stronger in Europe, this just happened to coincide with the age of imperialism, when European countries were going out and colonizing a lot of other places in the world. So white people from Europe were coming in contact with people they hadn't seen before. And by 1914, every single country, with the exception of 2, Liberia and Ethiopia, was colonized and to a certain degree possessed by a European nation. So this was pretty rampant, and this was at this point in time, people were looking for a lot of justification for what they were doing to people that looked different from the white people in Europe. So science started to be used back then and continued to be used into the 20th century to justify social power. But the people that really created racial categories were what we call armchair Eurocentric scientists. They were not people that traveled all over the world looking at people and comparing different people. They were people that were hearing stories from those Europeans that were traveling and bringing back the ideas that ended up getting translated into scientific categorization. You might wonder who assigned the original colors that were given to different groups of people. And I don't know if anybody will be surprised, but it was one of the most famous biologists, Carl Linnaeus. If anybody, nowadays, the Washington Redskins are in the process of changing their name, but the whole thing of Redskins comes out of this original color scheme that Carl Linnaeus came up with when he was classifying Homo sapiens in his work, Systema Naturae. Now, Systema Naturae was a big volume series that had at least 12 iterations during the lifetime of Carl Linnaeus. In the first edition, he sorted humans into those 4 color categories. By the 10th edition, Carl Linnaeus had named 4 subspecies of Homo sapiens, and these are the names he gave to them. But by the 12th edition, he'd really gotten into this human taxonomy, to categorizing and sorting people. And these are the descriptions that he gave. Number 3 are American Indians. Number 5 is Asiatic. And number 6 are African people. And these are the kind of descriptions that Carl Linnaeus put in his famous document. This is what he said about European or white people. So when you look at it all together, you can really see that there's nothing objective or value-free about this classification, especially given the fact that Carl Linnaeus had not traveled around the world looking at these people. He wasn't doing the anthropological work. He was just translating what he heard in Europe into a color scheme or a classification of humans that fit the ideas of the time. And that's important to say because it was at a very different time. People's thoughts were very different than they are now. But I don't think we can excuse this completely, and we certainly can't erase the fact that it set out that whole color pattern that's still used today. The big thing in biology is humans do not have any subspecies. When you classify humans according to their formal taxonomy, there are no zoological taxa below Homo sapiens, the name of our species. And the legacy of his fallacy still is so prevalent today. One of my friends teaches the second grade, and her kids in her class were going back and forth about, I can't play with you because you're white or black. She got so tired of it, she had them pull out their black and white crayons, and she said, hold up those crayons. Now, is anybody in this room as black as your black crayon? And they said no. And she said, is anybody as white as the white crayon? And they said no. And she said, I don't want to hear any more about this black and white stuff, because it just still carries through our culture today. Those of you that are about my age can remember when Crayola had flesh-colored crayons, and they were only the color of one group's skin. Nowadays, Crayola's marketing multicultural crayons, and they even have a big pack with 32 colors for teachers that are working with those kind of things and trying to put it out there in their daily lessons. But biogeographic diversity, which is what we're really talking about, not racial categories, is something that we know corresponds to latitude. We know that people with the darkest skin colors, and that's what this particular map depicts, live in the areas around the equator. And as you get further from the equator, skin tones get lighter. Continental populations, meaning groups of people that live adjacent to one another, always show continuous variation. You don't get people of one visual phenotype living next to people that are abruptly very different. There's always what we call in science a cline, or a gradual difference, because human populations are inclined to mix. And there's a lot of mixing that goes on in any of these areas that where people are living close together. But in the talk that I'm giving next week for TIES, I want to talk about how skin colors evolve to be different, and how skin color variation follows very much the patterns of human migration around the world. So the indigenous people, then indigenous means the native people, indigenous people around the world look different, but they are not genetically different enough to be categorized the way racial categories depict us to be. And the historical interpretations, like what Linnaeus said, have evolved and changed over time. And the way people take them is certainly context dependent. Depending on where you live, you hear different things about it. But I really, really feel strongly that this is something that I wish we could talk about more in our science classes. Having lived for 15 years in South Georgia, it's still amazing to me that there are people that will argue that the Civil War was not about slavery. I mean, this is how context can change people's perspective. I had a big argument with a rather large white retired policeman who kept telling me that the Civil War was for states' rights and not for slavery, right in front of a group of Black people that we were both working with in a golf project. But it's the kind of thing we know isn't true, and people can delude themselves into believing and still carry those ideas. Now, going back to the history, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was supposedly the first European scientist that actually put out this classification scheme after Linnaeus for human beings. And as multiple scientists started to talk about how different humans were, and there were not cameras in that day and age. These pictures were drawn by people or drawn after people came back with descriptions. But one of the things that they couldn't do was explain how all these different people had come out of common human origins. And you can see the name for the idea of Adam and Eve, that all humans had come from one origin, is called monogenism. So some of these scientists came up with an alternative called polygenism, and they literally spoke about the fact that humans didn't all come out of the same ancestry, that there had been different origins for the different peoples all over the world. And as ridiculous as it sounds, it was something that was perpetuated for a while to justify the descriptive differences that they were talking about. Samuel Morton was an American physician in Pennsylvania, and I guess we saw a lot of you are from Pennsylvania, so I don't mean to shame you and anything, but he was involved. His collection of skulls is kept at UPenn these days. But Samuel Morton did scientific experiments, and Samuel Morton's interest was in measuring the cranial capacity or the brain size of different people from all over the world. So Samuel Morton collected skulls. He had people that would go out and find graves of people of different ancestries and bring them back. And he was doing a bunch of experiments, and Samuel Morton became one of the most famous polygynists, and his writings literally talked about divinely fashioned racial divisions. They were attributing this to God at the time. These are some pictures of his skulls. One of the things he did, at first he filled the skulls with some kind of seeds, and then he realized that the seeds could be compressed. So he started to fill the skulls with lead shot, and he would literally quantify the size of the brains. Now, I always heard a flippant description of this, and they said he was all full of proof that Caucasian skulls held more birdshot than any other skull, until he got hold of some Asian skulls, and the brain capacity was larger than that of white people. I've never found any real historic evidence that that's true. I think it was just a sassy sort of thing that was thrown back about his work. Louis Agassiz was a Swiss ichthyologist who came over to the United States and worked up at Harvard. And he converted to this idea of polygynism when he saw Black people for the first time in the United States. He decided he wanted to try to do some scientific work on it. And one of the things they found out after Agassiz died was that he had drawers and drawers with hundreds of nude photographs of slaves in his office at Harvard University. And it was quite a scandal when somebody came across them in the 20th century. And I'll tell you a story a little later about what actually happened when that did. But this picture is not recent. This picture of Louis Agaziz's statue with his head in the ground is not somebody trying to remove his statue for racism. Apparently, there was an earthquake in California, and his statue fell off the roof of some building and landed upside down. And I just kind of laughed about it because I don't have a lot of sympathy for people that did the kind of racist things that he did. A lot of what went on were exaggerated animal comparisons. There was a lot of effort to make out that especially African people looked much more like animals. Now, here's a picture of a real orangutan and an orangutan skull, and it doesn't look like any African people that I know or any people of more recent African descent. But again, these things happened because there was no photography, and people were drawing pictures to represent what they wanted. The distortions of appearance got really awful in Europe, and in fact, this is if you want to ever know what one of the most horrible stories is, you can look online and find the movie called The Hottentot Venus. They took a woman from Southern Africa. They took a woman out of a tribe in Southern Africa and captured her and took her up to Europe and paraded her around to medical schools to show her how different people were. And they literally made her strip naked. They made her stand freezing cold in front of large medical school classes of just men at the time. And when she finally died of something she caught over in Europe, the French actually had her body stuffed. And her body was kept in a French museum until sometime in the 20th century when people found out about it. And I don't know what ended up happening to it, but it was pretty embarrassing for the French museum that had kept this poor woman as a taxidermied specimen after she'd been so abused by people that were trying to show literally a living example of how different people looked. Ernst Haeckel was is the biologist that's famous for drawing a lot of embryos, but he also managed to talk about racial hierarchies, and this is one of the schemes that he published in the 19th century. This is one that you see all the time, and I want to show you something very carefully about this kind of a picture. If you look at the three faces on the left that are depicted with their skulls sitting right here, if you look at each skull, you can really see how the distortion was carried out. If you look at the Caucasian skull, the teeth are oriented in a very horizontal manner. Looking at the monkey skull or the chimpanzee skull, the teeth, again, are oriented in a very horizontal manner. And you'll notice both of those skulls, the back of the skull is up off of the surface of whatever table they're on. But if you look at what they did in drawing the Negro at the time, what they called the Negro, look at the angle of the teeth here and look at where the back of the skull is. They literally tipped the skull back, angled the teeth forward, in an effort to exaggerate prognathism, which is how much the face juts forward. So they took a human being and literally redrew it to fit their concept at the time. And here are some other really flattering pictures that were also distributed in the sort of the same efforts. Now, the dehumanization of people from Africa went on into the 20th century. And this was this American biologist literally was publishing things like this in 1914, and it's pretty shocking that it's as close to now as it was. This is my kind of light humor on this, but I always wondered if the order were based on body hair, who would be considered closer to animals? And this is something cheeky that I usually put into my lectures to break it up for people. My African-American students roar with laughter, and the Caucasian students' eyes get really big. But who has more body hair? Caucasians certainly have more body hair than people of recent African descent. And so it just shows, it's all in what you want to look at and how you want to look at it. Now, this is a set of skulls that I wanted to show everyone, just so you could take a look at what real skulls look like. These are modern skulls, and if we were a live audience, I'd ask if anybody could racialize these or put them into racial categories or figure out which group they could be attributed to. And nobody has ever volunteered at any of my talks, but here are the names of the different people. And when I said I don't like to use the word race for anything other than social categories, I usually talk about things like this as ancestries. It's much easier to use that word without putting any value judgment on it. So the bottom line, and especially in the context of this talk, is why do people still think race is biological? Well, it's because bad science is still getting big press. 94 is a long time ago from now, but in 1994, when this travesty, The Bell Curve, was published, it became a New York Times bestseller. And the fact that other books came out immediately thereafter to refute what was written in there was never as big a selling point as the Bell Curve was. I still hear people referring to that book. James Watson, who's so famous for his work on the structure of DNA, has mouthed off and said pretty horrendous racist things on a regular basis. And I'll let you read this quote. This was the most recent one that got him in trouble with his employers at Cold Spring Harbor. So that's just a quick overview of sort of the racist history that came out of the discipline of biology. And now I really want to move into talking about how we go about distinguishing nature from nurture. Race itself is, as I said, a very slippery term. It's both quantitatively and qualitatively meaningless with respect to different groups of people. Quantitatively, race has always been baffling. How many races are there? Well, Adolf Hitler said 2. Early Europeans talked about 4. And by the time anthropology became an established discipline, they said it would take 150 to classify all the people in the world. So they just gave up on it. And anthropologists right away started to argue against race being a valid typological category for human beings. The US Census Bureau has always struggled with this. In 1790, they had 3 racial categories. In our last US Census, there were 7. But they've never been able to kind of figure it out. And most people don't like being put into these categories when they get the US Census. If you're a biologist, an effective classification system has to include every individual in the group that you want to classify. So when we look critically at the US Census, these are the categories that they had in the 2010 census. You can see that we can't look at this group of children and put each one of them into any of the categories that were on the 2010 US Census, unless you use other races for probably almost the majority of these kids. Classification is supposed to be mutually exclusive. Racial categories are not. And the number thing has never, ever been settled. Qualitatively, race is just as baffling because it's always been this issue of where do they draw the lines? What gets to count as what? Now that people are mixing, now that globalization has put people in closer proximity, people are intermarrying, and it's absolutely ridiculous to try to racialize people into these discrete groups. If you remember very recently, Elizabeth Warren, who was in the presidential race as a Democratic candidate, was challenged on the fact that she had declared that she had Native American ancestry, and so people tried to prove that she didn't. So she had her DNA analyzed by the group 23andMe, and according to one of their leading authorities that worked at Stanford University, she does have Native American ancestry. And that's not the picture I heard in the press, but who gets to decide who is whom? And Native American ancestry is one of the more complicated ones of any of the groups. This is a live picture of Bobby Jindal, who is a former governor of Louisiana. On the left is his gubernatorial portrait that is hung in the state capitol. And when you look at the way he was portrayed in his portrait compared to his natural skin color, it's a little strange. These are pictures of Bobby Jindal that were published at different times. And they said that the press used to lighten or darken his pictures depending on whether they wanted to depict him favorably or unfavorably in the South. One of the real secrets that most people have never heard about is the fact that Dwight David Eisenhower, the president that preceded Kennedy, had hidden Afro-Caribbean ancestry. This is the marriage photo of his parents, and his mother's grandmother was an Afro-Caribbean woman, a very Black woman that came out of one of the Caribbean islands. And Life magazine was going to publish a picture of his family, and they literally, when they found out that this would out him as not a white person, they literally pulled thousands of issues of Life magazine off of the presses. Now, this story I heard this from a very reliable source, but this hasn't gotten a lot of wide publicity. But you can read on the web a lot of things that talk about his different ancestry. And it's not very surprising because 23andMe, if you check a certain box on 23andMe's DNA analysis, they look at certain things and they use the data to examine things about the American population. And one of the things that they found is that in self-reported whites, there are quite a few people that have a fair amount of African ancestry. You'll notice that South Carolina and Louisiana, two of the states that had the largest populations of slaves, are also the states that have the most or the highest percentage of their Caucasian populations that consider themselves white, even though they showed genetic markers of recent African ancestry. So the whole thing about race is that the only way these quote unquote racial categories were maintained was by this process of endogamy. People used to marry within their groups. And as long as people, even when they came in contact with each other, had prohibitions like we did in this country until the 1960s, racial categories literally, held up for a while. But without the social isolation, gene flow happens very rapidly. And the kind of variation that people counted on for racializing humans is just going away. This is an issue of Time that was put out in the 90s, and they took different proportions of the the people in the United States and morphed them all with a computer program to show what the typical American would look like if all of the ethnicities were morphed into one. And this is the face of the woman they came up with at the time. And my students usually say she looks like a Latina. The demographics of our country are changing quite a bit. If you look in the older groups, white people are the predominant proportions of our populations. But as you go to younger and younger age groups along this particular graph, you see that the proportions of other groups are growing much faster. And at some point, they've always talked about the fact that the white majority numbers are going to go away. And they say that Americans of mixed ancestry are growing much faster than other groups in the US population. So is this whole thing of race confusing? Yes, it certainly is. And when it comes to how many, the only correct answer is really one. And that we can prove now with modern biology. And that's the good thing about teaching for social justice. The biology of human evolution and genetics can sort out exactly, where people came from, or to a pretty general extent where people came from. And the biology is much better understood now than it ever was before. I want to really give credit where credit's due. One of the scientists that's done the most work on this particular issue is a professor at Penn State named Nina Jablonski. And if you are interested in these subjects, go online and find one of her TED Talks, because I would love to be able to speak as well as she does. She's done a lot of the work. She doesn't do research on genetics, but she's an anthropologist. She's a biological anthropologist that has pulled things together in a way that's really, really put us on a good foot. So are racial categories accurate? Of course not. And there's no biological justification in the way people have been grouped. And when you get right down to it, it's just absolutely meaningless to try to put people in those categories and say it has any scientific significance. And if it's not significant, then why are we using skin color as a marker of human difference? Skin color is not coincidental with the kind of racial groups that people do. We know that people around the equator have fairly dark skin, but the people from these different places, and each of these faces is on the map where their indigenous people live, are not considered part of the same group. Africans are different from Melanesians and Polynesians, and it just doesn't line up. So when you look at a map that shows the distribution of people by their skin color with a horizontal orientation and dark skin close to the equator, one of the things that really puts race out the window is the fact that we can look at indigenous blood type distribution, and the type B blood orients in a very longitudinal way. Type B was a mutation that obviously came about in Asia, and it orients completely perpendicular to skin color. If race were real, those orientations would line up. People would be sorted by blood type in the same way they're sorted by skin color. So there's no geographical sorting of these races. And what I'll show next week is the fact that the genetic patterns really follow the migration routes of people as our ancestors moved around the world. And the bottom line is that all skin colors are not due to race, but adaptation for life under the sun. Humans are all the same. What is this doing? It isn't one thing, it's another. Biologically, race is nothing more than some kind of a name that's been given to variation within our species. There are no genes that segregate by races or continents or groups. And human beings as a species have a pretty low species diversity. our interspecific variation is one of the lowest of all mammals, less than 0.1%. And 88% of any of the diversity that humans have is found within any of the ethnic groupings that exist. Siblings, full siblings, which is brothers and sisters, are estimated. You can have, they estimate that we have anywhere from 25 to 75% genetic similarities to our full sibs. So they always talk about genetic recombination being approximately 50%. And that's much greater than the differences that are seen between populations on different continents, which has never been quantified to be anything more than 7%, but is usually given as being about 2%. So humans are a very large dispersed population with a very short evolutionary history. We've only been around for about 150,000 years. And that's a much shorter period of time than most other mammalian species. So the last thing I'd like to do really quickly is just talk about the current and future possibilities of teaching this for social justice. A lot of people today, after the George Foreman travesty, are talking about why we didn't know. And the answer is our eyes, as a group, our eyes must have been closed. Because how many times could these isolated incidents have happened? These are actually questions that were put to me by a very close African-American friend. And she just asked me, how could white people not have known? Another thing that's very important when you start teaching about these things is to be ready for the fact that it's very easy for people to claim that they're colorblind. It's one of the easiest things that white parents talk to their children about: be colorblind and don't notice color of other people. But if you say you don't see color, it proves you're not seeing racism. We need to develop a more sophisticated attitude toward racism in this day and age. We can't erase the past. We also can't tolerate what's happening around this country. Now, just the other day, one of my heroes died. And one of the things that John Lewis always said was, when you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. And that's always been kind of a mantra in the background of my mind as I teach for social justice. I really feel very strongly that addressing racism is one of the best ways we can deal with this in our educational systems. Because what you find out is a lot of people are not very familiar with the recent history. How many of you knew that minstrel shows were considered wholesome entertainment in the 19th century? When students get in trouble for wearing blackface, which happened very recently at my university, you find out that they have no idea that what they're doing is so wrong and so, I don't even know what to call it. So another thing that's always been in the back of my mind that I learned in graduate school was the famous Black writer Audre Lorde said one time, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And as a biologist, when I learned the history of scientific racism, all I could think about was the master's tools should be the thing that dismantles the master's house in terms of racism. But it's been a long haul trying to start speaking about this. When I first moved to Georgia, I put in a proposal to talk about this at the Georgia Science Teachers Association, and it was rejected on the idea that the science is not credible. At the time, the science had been, I had checked my scientific statements with geneticists, and it was just ridiculous. I never tried again to present this to their conference. I teach right now at a school that's considered an MSI, or minority serving institution, because 36% of our population is African American. And when you total all the students of color, it's almost 50% of our population. Yet in one of my classes, when we were on a field trip, a 3-day field trip, a Caucasian boy looked at an African American girl that was standing right next to me wearing a headscarf and told her she looked like Aunt Jemima. And I literally needed a brassiere to hold my chin up. I was so aghast. And I had to deal with this, and I put it aside on the field trip, and when we came back to school, I had to deal with it. But I found out at the time that many of the students were furious, and some of the other students didn't know why what he'd said was wrong. I've gotten pushback for teaching social justice issues in my classes. I literally have been told I should stick to the biology I'm supposed to teach. The explicit curriculum in my large lecture class which is called Evolution and the Diversity of Life, has 3 units. So in order to deal with the fact that I was getting this pushback from my department head, I made sure everything is in the syllabus. And I put the implicit curriculum that I was teaching in the syllabus, and I told him that I intended to continue to teach this. And these are the lecture topics that match each of the units that we were doing in that course. And most of my students are pretty satisfied. They like that a lot better than learning about mitosis and meiosis. But I'm protected. I have an easy time doing this because I'm protected by the idea of academic freedom and the fact that our university has quite a bit of rhetoric on diversity issues. I know it's going to be harder for a lot of you to start to infuse this into your teaching, but I really feel like if we get out there and talk about the genetics and the evolution, which I'm going to talk about specifically in the next webinar, it's going to do something to help people be better. I think a lot of Americans want to be better after what just happened. And if they understood biology, it would be much easier to do so. So we know that this is the case. And we know we're learning lessons from this current pandemic that show that certain groups of people are being disadvantaged a lot more than other groups in our culture. And I want to really congratulate Ties that this is the webinar that I'll be doing next week. And right after I do that, a real teacher is going to talk about what she does in her classroom. So we've got 2 webinars coming up to talk about how we do this in our teaching. And I just want to urge people to think about the fact that while we can't erase the history, we can help reframe our culture. A lot of things have changed. We no longer see signs like these all over the country. And the wonderful thing is that protests have changed issues of animal rights. Now, scientists have always pushed back on scientific racism. Stephen Jay Gould was very famous. He went tooth and nail with Morton's legacy, and literally was doing things with the skulls to see to quantify whether Morton's data was valid. Agassiz, who I talked about, this is a guy with the upside down statue, had an elementary school named after him in Boston. And when they found all those pictures of naked slaves, the children at the school insisted that the school be renamed. And it's now called Mary Baldwin School, which is the woman that was principal at that place for 33 years. They didn't want their school named after somebody who would have done something like that. I told you that James Watson had been repeatedly made obnoxious comments and racist comments, and his employers at Cold Spring Harbor terminated him as chancellor, and then very recently revoked all of his honorary titles because he went off on one of his other diatribes and said more things in a recent talk he gave. So what starts to happen and is that things are changing in the scientific communities. The American Association of People that Study Fish and Reptiles and Amphibians is literally going to rename their flagship journal because the person that it's named after is known as a rather famous racist for the work he was doing as a paleontologist. Even Carl Linnaeus has been challenged because the Linnaean games that were that is a sort of a college bowl setup is under pressure. And the Entomological Society is vowed to change the names of that pretty soon too. But we will see backlash as we push against the norms that justify racism. And the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science is drafting a plan to address systemic racism in our country. And And I'm really impressed with Sudeep Parikh because he literally said in a recent posting that he's been getting pushback from scientists, and he intends to stick to his agenda to work on the diversity of the scientific fields. So there are lots of different types of racism. But in biology classes, we can make a distinction between the biological and the social factors that go into this. And I'm convinced that anti-racist science instruction will untangle the web of confusion that surrounds this word race. And I want to sort of end it with a quote by a wonderful woman. Beverly Tatum was the president of Spelman College. And I'll sort of bring it to an end here so we have a little bit of time for questions. But these are her words about empowering our citizens with the vision that change is possible. So go ahead, Bertha, and if you can ask me some of the questions, I'll take down the PowerPoint.
Wow. That was, I hope I speak on behalf of everybody, a really, really amazing presentation. I think by far the most powerful presentation that TIES has ever had. So I'd like to answer the first question for everybody, which is yes, this session is immediately a recording. When I close this session, it takes just a few minutes and it becomes a recording that you can share with your friends and your students. The other question I'm getting a lot, Dr. Jones, is can you share the slides?
Actually, it's really hard for me to share the slides. I would be happy. Are you looking at my screen, or are they looking at better stuff than
We're
that?
looking at your screen. You could stop screen sharing. Remember the little thing at the bottom? There's two Chrome little windows in your taskbar.
Right. Okay, there it is. Okay, it's over here. Sorry.
That's okay. That happens to every presenter. That was awesome. So yes, I know the slides must be hard to present because you did a lot of talking and there was very little text on there. But
yeah, the slides, I would love to. I can send a PDF of those slides to anybody that wants it. What another slide said later on was that I judiciously use Google Images, and I have the right under U.S. copyright law to use it to teach. But I don't have proprietary rights over those slides. So I can't send people the slides. The one that I would send out that's hard to find are the pages out of Linnaeus's work, because I got those a long time ago and I've never been able to find them again. So certain things I can send out because there's something about copyright law that if anything's older than 75 years, it's not subject to copyright. Most of the other things, I'm like a Google freak, and I run around Google and find things that tie into what I want to say, because I have the attention span of a flea and I don't want to read text on slides.
I want to show everybody my t-shirt. I think that really goes with tonight's presentation. I just want to aspire to be less wrong. And I learned a lot today that'll help me in that direction. Let me ask you a few more questions. Colin, can we get professional development certificates? Absolutely. I put my email just a little second ago in there, bvasquez@centerforinquiry.org. Tell me which ones you attended, and I could create those certificates for you. For those of you asking for the slides or the PDFs, go ahead and email me, and I will put you in touch with Dr. Jones. Can you suggest books regarding this topic?
Yes, and the one that I suggested by Nina Jablonski is excellent. That is a really good read. She spends half the book on the biology and half the book on a lot of social issues. It's well written and very accessible, and that would be one of the best things that I could suggest. Now, one of the things I want to tell you, I think we're going to put up my my email address, but I would love to talk to people about these things and help anybody with anything they want. I'm the only Jones in the Department of Biology at Valdosta State University. Does everybody see what Michelle said up there? She said the entire Sistema Naturae is digital on Biodiversity Heritage Library. So I'll have to look at that. I love it when you start touching base with people. Here, and she put a link up there. This is so great. It's wonderful to make contact with people that have common interests, because for a long time I was doing this work by myself, and it just feels good that people started to care about this so much more now.
I believe I'm looking for the thing, she said Michelle Duen. She's in the society that just changed their name. She's an entomologist. And
Yeah.
So she did change the name. Here's a question. I can imagine my students saying, quote, if race is not biological, then how does 23andMe work? Any suggestions on how to reply?
Definitely. 23andMe works off of something that they're called SNPs, SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphism. 23andMe goes through your DNA and it finds different mutations that are markers of that are associated with certain populations. So if a mutation occurred in a population, that could be a marker for people in that part of the world. The people, I'll really go into this in detail next week, but the people that are most genetically diverse are the people in Africa because they've been around the longest. You see that? I see a really good question over here from Anita Stone. It says, as a biologist of color, do you think a lecture on this would be received differently by students? Of course, you know that people always respond to the color of the speaker. One of the reasons that I really liked speaking on this, I actually did my dissertation on the impact of racism and sexism in post-secondary science education. But it is much easier for me to speak out against racism as a white woman, because nobody can take it that this is my personal agenda. I want to believe a person of color that gives a good scientific talk will certainly run into some of the usual nonsense, but I think a scientist or a teacher of color could do this just as well, because if your science is good, people can't question you. That's how I answered my department head when he told me. I mean, my department head's not a nasty racist who wanted to do something to me. He was getting complaints from parents, literally in college. Parents were complaining that I was teaching this. And I said to him, the science is good. I have checked the science very carefully. And if you stick to the good science, people really can't dispute what you're saying.
And I
but
think
it is easier for a white person to do it.
See, now I have an echo. Anita, I just put in, somebody up above put in the HHMI biointeractive classroom resource, the biology of skin color. I do that every year with my biology class. I think if you approached it that way, it'll be successful. And next, I also put in here, let me put it again because it's scrolled down. These are the two coming up next week. I think Dr. Jones really talked about the background and the history, but next week we have the biology of skin color and we have race, it's not a thing. And both of those lessons, webinars can give you good resources to present this in class. Wow, there's more questions.
There's one from Danielle about skulls. And that's something, I have a friend that is a forensic anthropologist, and she swears, I'm outside of bones who can look at a dead person and say, or a skeleton and say, I know what age and race that person was. Apparently, there are some distinct markers that forensic people use, and I'm not going to say that they can't tell. I knew none of you could tell because most regular people can't tell. But people in anthropology have identified some aspects of the skeleton that can be attributed to different ancestral groups. And that's what I would rather call them than races.
I have some questions like on both things, so I'm looking at them. Race isn't a thing as you say, but what do you say about body and facial size, shape, other differences, since those are also things people mean when they mean race? So you're talking what you just said, right? The variation. Um,
Yeah, I mean there are other aspects. And when I do the biology talk next week, I'll try to hit this. But there are other phenotypic variations. We know that eye shape is certainly a phenotypic variation, and the epicanthic eye fold that makes people with Asia ancestry have different shaped eyes, and a fold on the inside of their eyes. There are phenotypic differences that are certainly attributable and have changed in different ancestral groups. But skin color is really interesting because it's the one where the genetics have shaken out, and we really have a good idea about how the skin color's sorted out. None of the others have been explained by the biological causes of changes as easily. Some people say something like maybe the weather made people's eyes have different shapes, but we know that skin color is attributable to the exposure to the sun. And Nina Jablonski came up with the biological reasons for it, and her work is excellent.
yeah. We have a comment here from one of our attendees, La Juana. She says, "What I don't like is when teachers try to teach the biology of skin color after a black man has been murdered by police. That is an inappropriate way of using it to say we're all the same to people being murdered by police. It's the ultimate gaslighting of students."
I can't disagree with that. And I'm not giving this. I guess I sort of the social justice webinar. This one tonight probably wouldn't have happened if the United States hadn't taken a good look in the mirror at what's been going on for a long time with the travesty of the George Foreman incident. I mean, we've had a bunch of those in the past, but it's if it's a wake up, then we got to use it. We all want this country to be better, I think.
Yep. I hope so. I hope this is a pivotal change. Uh, okay, so that's pretty much all the questions and all the time we have today. Where do we sign up for the webinars next week? I'll put it back up again. It'll be in the comments, Colin. It's also on the TIES webpage. But there you go. If you go to tieseducation.org, it's there.
You have my website or my email address?
I do not. So
I can tell you all, it's not very hard. It's Leslie SJ at valdosta.edu. So, or just look up Valdosta State University in Georgia, go to the biology department, and I'm the only Jones in there. And please email me with anything you want. If you want the PDFs, I'll put those slides together in a PDF, because I'm pretty sure that doesn't violate copyright if it's sent to you as a PDF. You can use it for the ideas that were there.
Wow. Okay. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much, my friend Sandy. And I thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope to see you next week when we actually talk about some lessons that can be used to teach the science behind, the biology behind some of these issues that our country is facing right now. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll let you put in your thank yous in there. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks again.
Bye, everyone.